So as we continue talking about some classic studies in psychology, again, what I'm really wanting you to focus on is this concept of the broad research idea or the question that was trying to be addressed, and then how they went about operationalizing that idea into an actual study. So this really is kind of focusing on these key examples, these big studies in psychology, but asking to look at them not just from their findings, because that's generally what we look at. We usually look at the results of studies. What did they tell us about human behavior? I want you to be thinking about these studies about what was the questions they were asking, what were theories that they were building on, and then how did they, the researchers, operationalize this into a cool study. So another study we're going to talk about is another fairly key study in social psychology, and that's people will believe others before they believe their own eyes. And this is really the impact of the group on decision making and reporting. And what was done here is a very simple experiment where people were brought in and they were basically being asked to judge the length of lines. And there wasn't very much ambiguity in these examples. So I have an example here. They'd be shown Exhibit 1, that line, and they were already asked, is this line most similar to A, B, or C? And I think the vast majority of people would agree A. And what they varied, and again, this experiment was done in a lot of different ways, but in the classic experiment, there was 4 or 5 participants that were all being asked to answer the question of what was the length of the line. And the actual participant, in other words, there was only one person who wasn't in on the study, and they were always the second to last person. So basically, the first example was given. The answer is A. The first person says A. The second person says A. The third person says A. Our participant says A. The last person says A. This happens 2 or 3 times. Then, basically, for example, they're given this exhibit again, and the first person actually says B. The second person looks at it seriously and definitely B. The third person says B. Now, here's the question. Is the person that's always been going along with the group going to stand out, or are they going to go against? And what would usually be found is the first time this occurred, the person would look agitated, they'd look confused, and there was about a 50-50 shot of whether they'd go with the group or they would disagree and say A. But as people continuously gave wrong answers, most people, almost 80% by the end, were going along with the group. And when they decided to go along with the group, they also showed a lot less signs of psychological distress. So again, you could argue, yeah, but there wasn't any consequences. This wasn't something being graded. But it again shows how susceptible we are to group pressure. Now, other experiments ramped up the value, whether or not they would get a reward based on the success of their performance. And generally speaking, if someone knew that I'm going to get $10 if I get all these right, but if I get them wrong, I'm going to not get any money. At that point, most people would go against the group. Not everyone, though. Some people would still go with the group, again, second guessing their own eyesight. Also, your position mattered. So basically, if you gave a right answer and then everyone else gave a wrong answer, in other words, you were in the first position, you were a little less likely to change your mind, and the more people that were involved, the more likely you were. So if there was 5 people that went ahead of you and they all agreed on a wrong answer, you were even more likely to agree with that wrong answer. But again, this is getting at the broad question of this study was what is the impact of social groups on our own decision making and our own reported behavior? And it found in a very simple study that we are very susceptible to group pressure. The next study, most people will hurt someone if they're told to do so. It's actually a really interesting study because of where it came from. This one actually came from, initially, this was a study set up to show that Americans were substantially different than Germans. And this is coming out of World War II. And the researcher that did this study was very interested in how could the German people basically participate in the Holocaust and go along with basically what most of the world would agree is just blatantly evil behaviors from a government. And initially, the person, being a scientist, said, well, the first thing I need to do is show that there is something unique about the Germans. And I'm not in Germany right now, I'm in the US, but what I can show is I can set up an experiment that would show that Americans wouldn't do what the Germans did. And basically, his hypothesis was the Germans said, we're just following orders. In other words, that's what was heard again and again in trials after World War II. When individual Germans were asked why they participated in various parts of the systematic extermination of people within their own country, their usual response was something along the lines, it wasn't my responsibility, I was just doing what I was told. So this researcher set up an experiment, and the experiment was fairly simple, straightforward. You would come to the experiment. This was at a fairly prestigious research institute. You'd be met by a researcher in a lab coat, obviously in a lab setting. You would be set down and be told that you're doing a study on learning behavior, and specifically the impact of punishment on learning behavior. You would be told there's another participant in the next room over. You would never see them. And you would be basically told that you, through a basically microphone system, would ask questions. And every time they got an answer right, you would just move on to the next question. But if they got an answer wrong, you would have to give them an electric shock. And after each wrong answer, you would have to increase the voltage of the shock. Now, here's where the manipulation was, is the actual voltage actually had warnings, painful, warnings, potentially fatal, all the way up to fatal on the dial, multiple settings. Each time you gave a shock, you would hear the next person, and it was recording, basically give a little ow. And these got worse until at some point they actually started to beg, please don't shock me again, I can't take it. At some point they'd say, I've got a heart condition. And finally, after a certain point, especially when the dial on the electrodes was actually at the danger or deadly level, the person would stop responding. If the person would basically, and almost everyone did, I can't shock them again, why don't you go check on them? They were simply told this is a part of an experiment, you have to continue. 70+% of people continued shocking who they thought was a dead body. Now again, you could make the argument that they didn't necessarily think this was real. However, interviews afterwards with most of the participants showed they were deeply distraught and they thought they had killed someone simply because they were told they had to do it by an authority figure. Now again, after this initial study, they actually conducted this study in many different ways. And basically what they found was you put it in a non-prestigious setting, you have the person that is giving the orders not look like they're an authority. It reduces the amount of people that are willing to go through with the experiment. But the numbers were always still disturbing. The worst case scenario they found, and that was in an abandoned barn that didn't even look like a research facility with someone that basically looked like, pardon my language, but a dirty hippie at the time. That's how they actually described it in the study. We still had over 30% of the people taking part in the study willing to go all the way up to thinking they killed someone. They also manipulated it where they actually could see the person they were shocking and see them actually experiencing pain. This was a much more complex study, obviously. And again, the numbers went way down, but there were still about 20 to 30% of people that basically thought they were shocking an unconscious, potentially dead person by the end of that experiment. This again shows the power of the situation, and that even Americans, or anyone, in fact, they did this study in almost every country. And by the way, they did find that Germans were a little more likely to participate and go through all the way to killing someone. In other words, they were a little more responding to authority. They did find that in some countries the numbers went down, but in all countries that they did this experiment, they found a surprising number of everyday people willing, if they were told to by authority, an authority that they recognized, to do something that went against their own morals and actually resulted in the potential killing of another person. They were willing to do it in an experimental setting. And these two experiments alone were big movement forward in us realizing just how powerful the situation and being in a group of like-minded people are. We like to be liked. We like to do what we're told. We don't like to step out and stand out. Now, again, there's individual differences. I said 70% went through. That means 30% people said, I don't care if I have to do it. I don't care if this is an experiment. I'm not doing it. So there's definitely people that are willing to resist, but the majority of us are not. So going back to that whole, is it the experience or is it the beliefs or attitudes that are more important? So this experiment actually built on the idea of cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance again, and that's that experiment where we're looking at the importance of whether or not changing a belief or changing a behavior is easier. And the idea behind cognitive dissonance is once the behavior has occurred, we tend to change our beliefs to match the behavior. You do something bad and you don't have a good justification for it, you tend to try to change your attitudes about whether it was bad or not, or whether it was as bad as you think it was. And based on this, further researchers decided what's more important, the behavioral response to emotion or emotions to behavioral response. And what they specifically were looking at is they were looking at what happens when we like someone. And they did experiments where they showed people they liked versus people they didn't like, and they hooked them up to a fair amount of medical equipment. And they found that in general, that when we like someone, our retinas basically open up, we let more light in, we want to get a better look at what we like. Our respiration goes up, our heart rate goes up, our galvanic skin response goes up. In other words, our physiological systems respond positively when we see anything that we really like, including a romantic partner. And then they asked, well, what other things cause that same response? And the answer there is fairly vigorous exercise. When you vigorously exercise, you have basically the same physiological response. So here's what they did. They basically took college students, they brought them in to where they either did a very low impact exercise routine for 30 minutes or a very high impact exercise for 30 minutes. So half of our participants randomly basically have had the biological responses started in their body that would also mirror their response to a positive stimuli, in other words, a romantic partner they like. So half the participants, their blood rate is not up, their heart rate is not up, their galvanic skin response is not going, and their irises haven't been expanded because they haven't been doing strong physical exercise. The other half randomly are basically mirroring those responses. Immediately afterwards, they were shown pictures of basically moderately attractive potential romantic partners and asked to rate them and also say how likely it would be that they would date that person. And what they found was a significant difference in the ratings, and everyone rated the same pictures. The people in the moderate and low activity that did not have their physiological systems basically stimulated rated the people relatively lower and were less likely to want to date them. The people that had basically had their physiological responses activated or excited to the point where it'd be similar to the response they'd have if they were around someone they were very attracted to, actually rated the pictures much higher and their likelihood to date the person much higher. So this is potentially usable to anyone. If there's someone you're really interested in, make sure your first date is something that actually facilitates a physiological response. Go for a run if you can. Maybe it's why horror movies are really popular. I don't know. I know the very first important date I ever went on to was to a horror movie, and it actually did not end very well. It wasn't a very good date. Fortunately, the person involved was willing to give me a second chance. We actually went to see a comedy the next time, and that date went much better. So take it with a grain of salt. Another experiment is basically, again, so that's an example. A is an example of previous studies facilitating a new research idea of applying what had been found in previous studies to a new setting. This next study, B, the more people, the less likely they are to help, was actually started by a news story. And that is a few researchers saw a news story about a person, Kitty Genovese, who was murdered in front of multiple witnesses. Now, actually, the media overplayed what had actually happened. So if we actually go back and start to piece together the police report, etc., it's not as clean cut as what the media reported. But what the media basically reported was that a person was killed in broad view of multiple people. None of them called for help. None of them went to help her. And basically, they just watched her die. And the media story basically suggested that this was the problem with big cities, that big cities made us heartless. Some researchers didn't like that explanation. They basically said, I don't think it has anything to do with big cities. I'm wondering if it had to do that everyone basically felt a diffusion of responsibility. In other words, if a bunch of people were all witnessing this, then it was very easy for each one of them to go, well, I don't need to help because someone else will. And what they basically did is create a lab experiment. And in this lab experiment, they basically increased the number of people involved in seeing a potential problem. And the potential problem was smoke coming into a waiting room in a lab. So basically, you'd come into the lab, and there was always only one participant. So everyone else involved in the study knew what was going on. In the first case, the person came in, and they were the only one there. And smoke started to pour in from the next room. In that condition, almost every single person, the second they saw smoke, they got up and they went to report it. The remaining conditions added extra people that were in on the study. And the extra people were told, don't pay attention to it, ignore it. So if you had one other person, it actually cut the number of times someone would go get help almost in half. And what you'd watch is you'd watch the person actually look up, see if the other person was paying attention. And if the other person wasn't paying attention and ignoring the smoke, about half the time they ignored the smoke as well. You had two people ignoring the smoke, it cut it down to about only a third of the people got up to tell anyone there was smoke coming into the room. 4 plus, very few people ever got up to talk about the smoke. Now, again, you could say, well, you've manipulated it too much. The fact that no one is paying attention to the smoke, that wouldn't happen if everyone was in on the experiment. That was the next experiment. In this one, again, if you were alone, you were very likely to go get help. Or now there's 2 people, but neither are in on the experiment. This was about 50% of the time. It really mattered if they both managed to look at it at the same time, make eye contact, and both start to talk about the problem. Very likely they'd both get up and go get help. But if one of them noticed it and looked at the other and the other one wasn't noticing it yet, and then they went back down to what they were doing, and the other person then noticed, look over at them and see that they're not currently paying attention, good likelihood neither of them would do it. And the more people you added, the less likely any of them would actually get up and start to talk to get someone to help them with the fire. Now, this experiment has been done in many, many ways and basically has found the same effects over and over again. Now, again, how can you use this in your own life? If you ever need help, don't assume just because there's a bunch of people that they can see you need help. You need to explicitly ask for it, and it works best if you pick someone out of the crowd. Make eye contact and ask them and basically say, you there, you go get help, you call the police. Because if you do that, they can't use diffusion of responsibility. But it's an important thing to recognize is that the most people, if they're in a large group, are less likely to help than if they're alone. If one person sees you needing help, it's very hard for them to ignore that need. Multiple people, it's very easy. And you can probably think of multiple times where you've seen someone in distress in a large situation and everyone ignoring them. I can tell you for a fact that I walked by quite a few people in New York when I was there, along with hundreds of other people at the same time, that probably were just unconscious or drunk, but I will never know. If I was alone in my hometown and I saw someone collapsed on a sidewalk, I would immediately go over and probably make sure they were okay. Now, some of that has to do with expectations, the size of the city, but some of that also is, in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, if they're really in danger, everyone else is seeing them too. That is the effect that was found by this study. So broadly speaking, what I'm trying to get across in this set of lectures is not just a review of various major psychological studies from the past or historical psychological studies. Again, I really want you to focus on how they started with a research idea, whether that idea was past research, whether that idea came from their own observations, or maybe even a news story. And then asked, how can we actually truly bring scientific methodology into asking this question using operationalizations to bring the idea into an actual study. So success in research is not just about the quality of the research, it also needs to be interesting, and also I'll add something that's not on this slide, generally usable. So if you find the results, how is those results going to be used to make the world a better place? So for example, the very last study, that actually told us something about how you can help yourself in a situation where you need help. That if you just assume that a large group of people see that you need help, that they'll just actually help, that's actually not what you want to be thinking. You want to be thinking, I need to explicitly ask for it, and I need to make sure that I ask someone specifically to do it so that they can't fall back on this, well, everyone knows about it, so it's not my responsibility. So a successful research career isn't just about knowing the methodology, it's also about asking interesting questions, and asking interesting questions that result in research that can actually be used. So success depends not just on the quality of your research, but also on people's response to your research. If it's not interesting or it's not high quality, it'll be much less likely to be published, much less likely to be presented, much less likely to be funded, and more importantly, in my opinion, much less likely to be usable by people. We want to do research that results in actually changing and making people's lives better. So where do these original research ideas come from? Lots of different places. A fair amount of research ideas come from armchair or beanbagging. That basically means just thinking about it. What interests me? What are things that I've experienced that I would like to know more about? What are patterns that I've observed that I would like to find out, are they actually there? Or is it just my gut response that I think that they're there? For the longest while, I actually had a pretty strong hypothesis that truck drivers, and again, not big trucks, just people that own trucks, tended to drive very poorly. And mainly this was because I was in a smaller car at the time, and a lot of times I was probably just I may have been just missed by the trucks, but I had noticed over and over again that every time it seemed like someone almost hit me or cut me off, they were driving a truck. So again, that might be a research idea. That might be, are truck drivers actually poorer drivers because they're less worried about hitting things, or they figure they're a larger vehicle and therefore they don't need to worry as much. It actually made me wonder when I bought my first truck what kind of driver I would be. But that's a bean bearer armchair. I'm not looking at previous research. I'm just basing my own experience, but I'm asking myself, is my assumptions actually correct, and how would I test them? And that's also coming from personal experience. So armchair and beanbagging often comes from personal experiences, personal observations. You can also look at previous research and theory. So you can look at previous studies and ask, how could I apply this differently? How could I apply it to a new setting? How could I make it to where it would answer a question about this research or provide a new avenue of use for this research? Sometimes it might just be incubation. Incubation means you have an idea, but it's not a great one, and you just let it sit for a little bit, but you also make sure you're occasionally returning to it and thinking about it again. Is there anything else I missed? I do my best incubation early in the morning, usually when I'm exercising. When I'm exercising in the mornings, I'm often trying to think about various things that I've been worried about or trying to figure out problems to, and sometimes those include research ideas. And sometimes some of my best thoughts come up after I've already thought about it a few times. Sometimes it might be pure need. So for example, when we were talking about the poker hands making attendance better at a logging company, that was a study born purely on need. Might be the application of a novel perspective or theory to a new setting. So for example, sometimes we might want to do a lit review or do previous research and theory, not in the field that we're normally researching in, but other fields. So a lot of times when we find new or interesting theories, they're actually not, they're new to the field we're in, but they may be from another area. So for example, psychology often draws in from speech language pathology, from teaching and teaching theory, from theoretical examinations of human behavior. Sometimes it's just being in the right place at the right time. So again, our researchers that were looking at the Kitty Genovese news article, they ran across that news article and it led to them asking a bunch of research questions and therefore creating studies to look at the example of bystander effect. And that also then plays into just watching what occurs in everyday life. So some researchers actually start this way systematically. They observe behavior. A good example actually of this, of a study, is basically whether or not people are willing to help based on whether they're observed. And again, helping behavior can be affected both ways. And one of the things also is people are more likely to be dishonest when no one knows who they are. They're much less likely to be dishonest if people can identify them. And studies based on that were based on, again, just basically watching large groups of people's behavior in large settings. And researchers noticing that when there was less people around, if someone dropped something, it was actually more likely that someone would steal that. If someone dropped something and a bunch of people observed you finding it, you were much more likely to bring it back to the person who had dropped it. So if you kind of got a better feeling now for where research comes from, it's really, again, not only are we coming up with a research question, we now need to turn it into not just a theory, but a specific hypothesis. And part of that is also, do you know the population you're interested in enough to ask important questions? So how can you ask an interesting question about a population you know nothing about? So let me talk briefly, and we're going to get into this in more detail. But when we talk about a population, what we're talking about is the people we want to generalize to. So if you are a theoretical social psychologist that's trying to come up with the basic understanding of how people everywhere behave, your population is all people. If you're a geriatric psychologist looking at how people behave from the ages of 70 to 80, your population is all people 70 to 80. If you're a sociologist wanting to examine how people behave in New York City in Times Square, your population is everyone that goes to Times Square in New York City. Sometimes your population may be much smaller. You may be trying to do an intervention for a specific class at a specific university. In that case, your population is college students at that university that take that class. But you do want to identify who is it that you want to generalize to. And then once you know that, that helps you decide how do you sample that population. In other words, how do you get a group from that population to be in your study? And is the group that's in your study representational of your population? So for example, if I was really wanting to do a study looking at behaviors of people that are in Times Square in New York City, and my sample is college students in Nebraska, is my sample in any way related to my population? Probably not. If my research question is people in general and my population is Psych 111 college students, again, that might be a good convenient sample. It may answer some questions, but it's not necessarily getting, at least initially, to the population that I'm interested in. So just because you know your population, you may not have the resources, time, and ability to actually get a representational sample, but you should at least be able to talk about, does your sample relate to your population, and how well does it relate to your population? So the main points of generating research ideas: the generation of ideas is a necessary and important part of research. And it shouldn't be necessarily willy-nilly. It should be somewhat systematic in its own way. And once you have a general idea, almost always the next step is going to be a lit review. You're going to see, what have other people done about this idea or this theory that you've come up with? Is there research out there? And can you meaningfully add to the existing research? Remember, the best research is both interesting and of high quality. And high quality means rigor. In other words, the study itself should be a pretty solid study that answers the questions that you're asking, at least in a limited way, and it should be interesting. And I want to add that when I talk about interesting, it should also, to some degree, have some practical impact as well. It should be usable, either to generate additional research or, ideally, to actually generate changes in the real world that make the world a better place for people. Conducting research that is interesting and of high quality will increase the likelihood that you'll be a successful researcher, and a successful researcher really means your research is actually being used and is having an impact in the world. And finally, there are many sources for research ideas. You use whichever ones work best for you. Some people use all of those concepts. Some of them actually have a preferred method. I have a very close friend that's a very successful researcher that pretty much beanbags all their ideas. All their ideas come from them basically purposely sitting down and brainstorming until they come up with an idea. I tend to generate a lot of my ideas from personal experiences. But again, each person is going to have their own kind of favored method, but all of them are equally valid. It's the process, though, of once you have that research idea, can you operationalize it into a decent study, a rigorous study, and the lit review to help you do that in a way that makes that research more likely to be used, and to help you focus on, what's the population, what kind of sample do I need, and how do I make sure this is both interesting and rigorous so that it'll be used by people.